So, hello and welcome to the latest webinar in the Elemental Talks program. Our topic today, Breathe Right, the importance of air quality in today's built environment, in our session sponsored by ACO. The chair for the next 60 minutes, my name is Jim McClelland. I'm founder and editor of SustMeme, home to both the magazine and the top 500 rankings. Joining me on the panel this afternoon are Ian Mawditt, Director, Four Walls, Professor Timothy Sharpe, Head of Department of Architecture, University of Strathclyde, and Chris Jones, CEO, HomeLINK, which is part of ACO. It is all live. Q&A to finish, so please pop your questions in the appropriately named Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen. If you do your typing there, you pose them, I'll ask them, and they'll answer them. So this webinar forms part of a program of talks hosted and produced by elementalexpo.com. For those of you not familiar with it, it is the online community for professionals focused on innovation in heat, water, air, and energy, the vital elements within the built environment now and in the future. You'll find a full range of events on the website, loads of upcoming webinars. You can also view the back catalogue and a whole host of hot topics. You'll be able to view this again almost immediately after we've finished, all available on demand. Great list of speakers, and I should add, everything is free to access. There is no cost. Plus, ta-da, next year, the physical, real-world, in-person Elemental Expo will be taking place at the NEC Birmingham, 21 to 23 June 2022. So, see you there, albeit with masks on and bumping elbows potentially. So, right, by way of a very brief intro from me, because we've got plenty to cover, the quality of the air we breathe is integral to our health. Obvious. Most of us now spend a significant amount of time indoors as well, thanks to the pandemic, which has brought to life the huge issues we have with indoor air quality. Some of the scary stuff in the short term, polluted and poor indoor air quality can cause such symptoms as irritation of the eyes, nose and throat, headaches, dizziness, fatigue, lead to colds, even pneumonia, including childhood pneumonia. Bad IAQ has also been linked to serious health conditions such as cancer, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and cardiovascular diseases too. In addition, as if you needed any more, there are impacts on general well-being, mood, appetite, knock-on effects on concentration, activity, fitness levels, implications for education and employment, attendance, performance, the list goes on and on. So with the Future Home Standard hopefully becoming concrete over the course of the next 12 months or so, this debate session brings together experts who truly appreciate and understand the importance of that air quality, with experience in assessing and delivering the practical applications and solutions we need to make IAQ paramount in every built environment. So let the debate begin. So as we start to explore the importance of air quality in practical applications, what difference we can make, some of the solutions to the common problems, I'd like to begin by asking our panel to introduce themselves, of course, but to share some opening insights. Briefly, it's kind of who are you, where do you fit into the puzzle, what's the state of play right now with indoor air quality. So first up, Tim, from an architecture perspective, where does IAQ fit into design thinking?
Good afternoon, everybody. So brief introduction. So I'm Tim Sharpe. I am the head of the Department of Architecture at the University of Strathclyde, a position I took up just nearly 2 years ago. I started this job 3 weeks before the pandemic started in a piece of genius timing. Before that, I was the director of the Macintosh Environmental Architecture Research Unit. So my background is in architecture, it's in building design. It's always been about low energy buildings, environmentally friendly buildings. In more recent years, we've been doing lots of work looking at how those buildings perform. And one of the areas that's taken us into is looking at the importance of ventilation, both from an energy perspective, but also more recently from a health perspective as well. So buildings are entirely reliant on having good ventilation. So my kind of interest is in how we design buildings, holistically, in order to have good performance, both in energy and in environmental design. I suppose the kind of question, where are we now with the state of play with indoor air quality? Well, the simple answer is we don't know, and that's one of the big challenges we have here. We do not routinely collect information from buildings which are designed and constructed. It's one of the few areas of design and manufacture where you don't routinely test what you produce. So we have actually very little knowledge of how buildings are actually performing. What I can tell you is that in most cases, when people go and study those buildings, they do find significant performance gaps, both in energy, but significantly in terms of indoor air quality and ventilation. And we've been involved in a number of studies which have done that. And I know that the other speakers, Ian particularly, has found similar kind of things. So at the moment, we have a dearth of knowledge. We have an absence of evidence, and that's one of the challenges which we need to address kind of moving forward. We know that there is poor performance. We know that there is poor ventilation in buildings. So trying to get a better handle on what that is, but then importantly, what we do to fix it is kind of critical. So that's my area of interest. This has been brought into kind of sharp focus in the last certainly kind of 18 months. So one of the things I've been involved in, I've been part of the SAGE Environment and Modelling Group, looking particularly at kind of aspects of ventilation in relation to COVID. And it's the same problem. We know that COVID is an airborne disease. There is aerosol transmission, and ventilation can play a part in that. But trying to evidence that has been a significant kind of challenge. So again, that's one of the areas which we're trying to move forward on.
Excellent, thank you. Good introduction. Energy, health, environment, holistic building design. In terms of where are we? Candidly, you've said, in many cases, we don't know. We're working blind, or if you like, we're working nose blind, perhaps up to a point. There is a real knowledge gap. And in terms of performance, that brings me nicely onto you, Ian. In building performance, user experience, where do you see the state of play at present, Ian?
Yes, interesting one. I'll introduce myself first briefly. So yes, I'm a building performance researcher, sort of field investigator, as well as looking at energy and carbon efficiency of buildings. A key focus is on ventilation effectiveness and the impacts on indoor air quality, which before pandemic was more of a focus on the fact that buildings have become more energy efficient and airtight, and therefore just to wish to ensure that buildings don't impact the health of the occupants. So that's kind of the niche that I've been involved in for the last decade or more. And I approach my work, I think, more from an engineering discipline rather than an architectural discipline, to try and come up with the solutions. But I'm not an environmental scientist either, so I'm not an expert as such on the toxicology of pollutants. So there's quite a big sort of area really where different people with different levels of expertise can try and help solve the indoor air quality puzzle. I mean, a lot of my research feeds into it's often associated with larger field studies, many of which are funded directly or indirectly by government. And the outputs of those are often used to inform the ongoing revisions to building regulations, in particular for Part F, for England and Wales, and for Part L as well. So I help the UK government and the Welsh government develop their approved documents in those areas, and the Future Home Standard, as you referred, incorporates those two approved documents, which are forthcoming next year and have been out for consultation now. So yeah, in terms of state of play for the where are we with indoor air quality? Well, we do know it's of increasing concern, and a lot of that is due, I think, maybe obviously we're moving to more airtight building stock, but there's the general lack of awareness and the understanding of the risks and hazards by people who live in homes and occupy buildings, offices and other workplaces. It's only really the industrial sector that's got a good handle on pollutants in some of their buildings because of the activities. So unless there's a particular problem in a building, that might be overheating and stuffiness, it might be damp and mold, there isn't really a call to action for the user. And that's why I guess in some ways it's been become a bit more of a concern, because other pollutants, as Tim touched on, such as chemicals and other more hazardous pollutants, are invisible and undetectable, certainly by our olfactory system. So they then can go largely unknown and cause background levels of emissions and problems that affect our health over time. So it depends on the levels of our exposure as well, the amount of emissions and the toxicity of those emissions. And more recently, again, Tim touched on, due to the pandemic, we've got concerns about indoor air quality for other reasons now as well, and helping to try and prevent the spread of a virus. With the pandemic, we've also spent a lot more time inside, particularly in our homes, and our homes, I guess, are also, on one hand, the least regulated environments. The workplace, like an office, has got much stricter enforcement of, for health and safety reasons, the air quality and the maintenance and so on of ventilation systems. You don't have that in the home. But on the other hand, in a home, you've got individuals that are more familiar with their environment and have more individual control over their environment. And we can also thank the media for showing us a great array of ventilation diagrams over the last 2 years, the likes I've never seen before outside of my engineering books. So it is becoming more and more, I guess, in the public domain about the importance of ventilation as a result of the pandemic. And I guess time will tell if these become new habits post-pandemic, and it might help to put indoor air quality generally on their radar in the future.
Thank you. And yeah, moving it up the agenda, I think this is the first of all the webinars I've chaired where anybody's thanked the media. So I will take that with gratitude. It's a rarity. So yeah, ventilation, good message about pre and post pandemic approaches up to a point, but still a lack of awareness, a lack of call to action, that knowledge gap. And interesting you mentioned about the fact that effectively the home is the most inhabited and the least regulated environment in many cases simultaneously. So you kind of mentioned design, engineering, science, the various disciplines, and of course nicely brings me on to tech, the other piece in the puzzle potentially, Chris. So when it comes to IoT, Internet of Things, data and analytics, where is IAQ in the digital age, Chris?
Yeah, so I think where I kind of fit in, I suppose, in this webinar is, we're trying to really develop a solution or a technology to try and solve some of these problems that are being highlighted by the smarter people in the room, at the moment, and taking the science and looking at the regulation and trying to take it to that next level, and that's kind of where we focus. So I lead the HomeLINK team within ACO. HomeLINK, as the HomeLINK CEO, we were acquired by ACO last year. They're the UK market leaders for smoke and CO alarms, with a really big footprint in social housing, 90+%. And we're the smart home aspect of what they do now. And our ultimate sort of goal is really just improve the health, safety, and well-being, and in a similar way to it already has been with smoke and CO alarms. But this is kind of the next level of that, and also being driven by legislation in a similar way. We really think that IoT technology is a real key to this, and will make people more aware of the issues, I think. We've now got about 80,000 connected devices already connected in housing, so it's not as new as some people think. It's grown quite rapidly over the last few months as well. And the new indoor air quality sensors, so particularly CO2, temperature, humidity, that we've really recently released around basically target issues around disrepair, molds, aspects of fitness for human habitation, which, to be honest, you see a lot of disrepair problems in the news, and a lot of the time it's actually quite a new building or a recently retrofitted property that's got really bad mold problems and is really unhealthy to live in. And it's probably because it's because of all the reasons that listed in PAS 2035, which is why we have it, thanks to people that are working on that. We've also, as has been mentioned about COVID, we've got projects. We've got completed projects. For example, we've got a local authority in Scotland where we've rolled out sensors across 50 schools. So there's about 1,400 sensors, and that's purely for ventilation monitoring. And we have a number of other schools and LAs and things like that in that respect as well. So in terms of I2 and the kind of digital age, I think prior to this moment in time, it was really impractical to measure, indoor air quality on a sort of mass scale in its sort of continuous fashion. And I think that's one of the reasons that people weren't really aware of the problem. I think Tim mentioned earlier about there being this kind of, things were in place to make sure homes are sort of healthy. It was known, but actually when you've gone back to sort of do the analysis that they're not the standard thermally or in terms of healthiness. And I think that really what's driven that technology is sort of advancements in battery technology, sensor technology, data science. They've all kind of come together at this point in time to make it just sort of cost effective at scale as well. And you can really see that it wasn't long ago seatbelts and things like smoke alarms weren't regulated, and actually they're proving to save lives, and now they're regulated, and that's kind of you can sort of see it beginning to happen with these kind of technologies as well. But it's quite frightening just looking at and we're talking about not knowing the problem, but just looking at some of the data we have, monitoring tens of thousands of rooms and things with carbon dioxide, for example, and you see huge levels in some instances that have been taken care of. Sometimes it's a sort of building problem. Sometimes it's a kind of living situation problem. But beyond carbon dioxide and general indoor air quality, even carbon monoxide, which is recently there's been stricter regulation around that. We've seen one landlord recently, the first 400 homes that they installed connected carbon monoxide alarms. I think 10 of them had either low level or high level CO. So homes which they thought were free from carbon monoxide, 1 in 40. So imagine a school classroom of 40 kids. Imagine one of those in that home there's carbon monoxide. Obviously, that's something you need to go and fix immediately. But and obviously every year there's gas safety checks take place, but it's surprising it's missed. And that's more of an extreme case. But that sort of levels we're seeing fairly frequently. And obviously, the more airtight you make a home, suddenly those low levels, which people have lived with, we've seen over time, go from being low level and sort of unhealthy to high level and quite dangerous. So there's a lot of kind of factors at play.
Yeah, good point there. Nice point. And you sort of highlight that we're almost it's so early doors that we're still understanding the scale and the depth of the problem, never mind in some cases even getting on to talk about solutions. We're not at that kind of seatbelts moment you described for IoT, although it's good to hear about 80,000 connected devices. I know I used to be mentioning in articles a while ago that we'd have 1 trillion sensors worldwide, and the date that was forecast for was 2030, and then it jumped forward to about 2025, and I haven't checked recently, but we're probably already there when you think about the number that are in your cars and phones and things. So we are in a sensor-rich environment, but of course it's one thing having data, it's another thing having the analytics and the understanding to use it in any sense. And your comments perhaps on air tightness maybe remind me that back on, it was over 10 years ago, the BRE Innovation Park in Watford, when off-site construction was enjoying its first surge, if you like, they had some properties there designed to high levels of air tightness. They had a family living in them and recording their experience of that environment. And there were some difficulties with the quality of the air in it. But that was 10 plus years ago. And, in some cases, we are still investigating that scenario now over a decade further down the line. So thank you for those introductory comments. Now in this bit, which I call challenges and conflicts, in the middle session, I'd like to throw down the gauntlet a little bit, challenge our panel, why we have such a long way to go in terms of delivering high-grade indoor air quality as standard, I hasten to add, rather than some relatively unaffordable luxury. So I want to get into what's the problem. Lack of standards, understanding, monitoring, spend. We've touched on some of it already. But what has to change for good IAQ to become just a real baseline for health and well-being? So, Ian, I'm coming to you first in this section. So, future home standard on the horizon. I know you consult and advise on various standards, but to be able to breathe a quality of indoor air that doesn't make you ill or unwell, if not actually a basic human right, does seem it should be a basic building reg. So why do we not yet have that set of mandatory standards that make it just simply a matter of compliance and enforcement? Why are we not there, Ian?
It's a good question, but I mean, a short version of that is we could argue we already have standards. And to extend Chris's car analogy, one can pass a driving test and demonstrate that they've shown that they understand the rules of the highway code, leave the test centre and drive 100 mile an hour at the motorway. and break the law. And the question is, will they get caught? Well, that's a game of chance. And it's not that dissimilar in the building sector. We do have a set of regulations. When it comes to ventilation and indoor air quality, that's really governed by Part F in England and Wales, and the guidance which has now been updated in the Future Home Standard for domestic buildings and Future Building Standard for non-domestic buildings. As I said earlier, it has been consulted on, it has been updated. It's also been updated in line with pollutant standards, pollutants that are of concern, that were issued by then Public Health England, to give us extra information around the pollutants that we are most likely to find indoors that we should update our ventilation standards in accordance with. So those have all been reviewed, and the ventilation standards have been updated in the consultation accordingly. And I might have a biased view on it, being part of the technical team behind developing some of the ventilation standards there. But I'm firmly of the view still that the ventilation provision that we have as a minimum standard is adequate. And I'll repeat that again, that it is a minimum standard. One can always do better than the minimum standard. And I think some of the confusion in I guess in all aspects of building regulations, but I'll stick with Part F, and that is that I guess in some ways, as a practitioner involved in the design of buildings as well, not just in the evaluation of, then I often see design submissions for planning, for example, that just say the ventilation shall comply with Part F, and that might be as far as the ventilation specification goes. That's just, in my mind, wholly inadequate on behalf of the designer to submit such a statement. You're essentially obfuscating responsibility there onto the regulation to design the system for you. And the regulation, the standards in the regulation shouldn't be used as a design target. As I said before, they are minimum standards, and they shouldn't, if you just use that as your design basis, then it's effectively a race to the bottom. So that's the one thing I would say on standards. When it comes to the enforcement of, again, it is a case of, who should enforce this? And quite often, the main police, if you like, in the building context is the building inspector, building control. And it's all too easy, actually, in some ways, to say, should they be checking this more rigorously, more adequately, to make sure the ventilation provision does meet at least that minimum standard. And some of the changes that we have proposed in the revisions to the approved documents have simplified the guidance to make it easier for designers to follow. It makes it easier for inspectors to check that compliance is demonstrated. But when it comes to mechanical ventilation systems, for example, they're really reliant on the installers and commissioners providing them with a commissioning certificate, in the same way that an electrician provides a test certificate at the end. They don't go and do the electrical testing themselves. And I think really this starts to become the nub of the issue. Where we have gas safety certificates, and for obvious reasons, gas has been a well-regulated industry and well-audited industry. Electricity was the same, but thanks to advent of technology of safety electrical devices and so on, electricity is less of a risk. But nonetheless, we have a tradition of having better informed standards and self-regulated industry. But ventilation doesn't really sit naturally in any of the disciplines, and I think it's unfair to expect building control, if they receive a commissioning certificate for a mechanical system, for example, and then it's later found that mechanical system is underperforming and the air quality is poor and there's condensation, damp and mold and other problems that residents will complain about, and they do. to point the finger at building control, I think, is unfair. So how do we enforce this? I think is a debate I'll continue to have for the rest of my working days. I'm hoping it improves. There are good news stories in other countries, such as Belgium, where they do have schemes which are akin to, in some ways, to our robust detail scheme for Part E for sound control, which has been a very successful scheme since its introduction 10 years ago, maybe more, a bit more than that. Where it's actually embedded in regulation that you can either test your building at the end of the day for acoustics, or you can buy into the robust details sort of audit process, whereby you pay an amount per plot that you pay to the robust details scheme, and you sign up to the standards required by that scheme, which also includes random inspections by the scheme auditors. That has proven to be incredibly successful, and there are schemes in Belgium that are very similar to that for ventilation. Personally, I would like to see similar to enforce our standards here.
Excellent, really interesting examples there. And yeah, I'm hearing they're saying it's not a lack of standards, it's in many cases the application of them, but regulations don't design, designers do. And I'm probably putting words in your mouth, but to a point, I heard you calling out designers, I heard you potentially calling out installers or manufacturers maybe in defense of the regulators up to a point. So interesting stuff. We're getting into the meat of it here. So Chris, if I come to you next, so let's be clear here: smoke, CO2, temperature, humidity, they're all things that can be measured and monitored via life-saving tech. Potentially it's affordable. So simple question, what's the problem? Are we afraid to actually know, maybe we touched on this earlier, know the truth about IAQ because we then have to do something about it?
Yeah, I think there is a element of that I think is changing. Just to go back to something Ian said earlier, which I agreed with everything you're saying there. Yeah, I think it's that proof of that standard. And obviously, sometimes people will fit the units correctly as according to PAS 2035, and then it either doesn't work for its for whatever reason, but it also could be what we've seen recently is occupants not wanting to use electricity on the fan, so they keep it switched off, and it's like there's no one that can do anything about that except the individual. So there's a quite complicated sort of situation, I suppose. But just calling back on that, some things I remember from my army days, like there's always a saying that what gets measured gets done, and on a compliance point of view, like I said with the carbon monoxide earlier. There's a gas safety certificate every year. Every landlord has to demonstrate that their homes are free from CO according to Fitness Human Habitation. And then you have the gas safety aspect as well. But yeah, we're seeing, from the data, quite a lot that do have it. And if that becomes legislated in the future, which you can imagine, if the data shows that lots of homes have this really unhealthy situation going on, you can see that being legislated and will have that positive impact. And I guess it's a bit like on the sort of speeding analogy in the cars again. Having another thing back from the army was they sure have this in a lot of industries. They'll have like a accelerometer sensor in the car which sends back information about your driving. And before that, people were crashing the cars all the time because they're driving too fast and things like that. And then those rates basically went down to zero, because if you went round a roundabout and got a red because the force was too high because you're going around it too quickly, you got in trouble for that. And then suddenly, even though everyone was supposed to, drive one way, suddenly they actually were, because it was being measured, which I just think is interesting. But yeah, so in terms of, are people afraid to know the truth? I think when we first started speaking to landlords, social landlords, about this and issues of mold, a lot of them would say, we've got lots of issues with damp and mold. Some of them would blame it on the residents, some of them would, take some responsibility. But generally, a lot of people would be kind of worried about what they're going to do with the data, or what if it says we've got 1,000 homes with an issue that we've got to go and fix? Can we afford to do that? So there was always apprehension in the beginning. But I think, given that all the stuff in the media recently around disrepair of landlords and all these different things, that's starting to change, and particularly with the Fitness for Human Habitation coming into force, there's a growth in claims from residents if there's mold issues and things like this. So we're seeing a lot of growth around these sensors for that reason, for a compliance reason from landlords. And for that reason, I think we're going to reach this point in time where the mindset is, okay, well, it feels unsafe to do something about it because we don't want the data is going to harm us. We need to keep our head in the sand too. Well, if we don't do something about it, others are, and people are going to start asking questions. But having said that, I do think a lot of landlords are on track, positive. And yeah, I mean, we had a recent BBC little kind of mini documentary sort of thing, where we were working with residents in Poplar Harker, and you can actually see the reality is, residents are really interested in the technology. They want to use it. Once people understand the impact of the indoor environment on their health, they're keen to sort of take control of that and have do something about it. And that's good for the landlord because it means the resident has the knowledge and is empowered to know what not putting their mechanical ventilation unit on is doing to their health, their family's health, their home's health. Yep. And it's what it is a massive win-win. But yeah, I suppose in the beginning, people are naturally kind of afraid of change or technology and things like that, but it changes over time.
Yeah, good points made then. As you say, we're maybe going to get to that tipping point, if you like, where it's more dangerous to do nothing than to do something kind of thing. So, but maybe we're not always there yet, and it's still in compliance mode. But as you say, the old adage of to manage it first, you have to measure it. Well, I would say this as a media person, but I always add, but often you have to then message it. And there's a real communication piece around all of this. We can talk a lot about the tech, the regs, the science, but there is also that cultural communication piece as well to get that message through. And that kind of maybe brings me also to the final question this round for you, Tim. It's probably a bit unfair. It's quite broad, but it's what will it take? So if anything, we've sort of touched on this, was going to focus the efforts of the built environment sector on good IAQ, surely it was a global pandemic spread by airborne transmission, leading to national lockdowns with us stuck/safe indoors. Shouldn't that be the tipping point? So, Tim, why is it even still up for debate?
Okay, thanks. No, it's an interesting question. I'll maybe pick up on a couple of points which have been made already, actually. So one of them is the whole sort of the car speeding analogy. So one of the problems at the moment is that none of our cars have speedometers. So there's nothing in houses which allow us to determine how they're performing. So that's the first kind of problem. The second issue is this thing about, so building regulations are the law. The building standards are the police who might catch you breaking the law. But if your building is not compliant, then you're the one who's breaking the law. So that's the other sort of issue there. I think the other point I'll make is this thing about, I completely agree with you, about sort of quality of design and intention there, and this race to the bottom. One of the challenges there for people who commission designers is you get what you pay for. So when I first started in practice, designer would get something like 10%. Now you're lucky if you get 2. You probably get a lot less than that. So you get what you pay for in terms of design effort going into something. So yes, that's the sad truth. A lot of it does become a bit of a box ticking exercise, which then doesn't always get caught or picked up in reality. However, so and one of the issues is that when in the past, when we've gone to talk to building standards about sort of problems about things like this, their sort of worry, well, their sort of feedback is, what are the causal effects of that? So if something terrible like Grenfell happens, then regulations change pretty much overnight. But it's very difficult to make these relationships between health and buildings. We know there are lots of associations, but trying to have that smoking gun is hard. Now, clearly, the pandemic has changed that. We know that the fact that the vast majority of infections have been in buildings for all sorts of reasons. Yep. Now, a lot of those are to do with the fact that people are close together. They're doing stuff. They're talking to each other. All that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But some of that will be to do with lack of ventilation in some kind of spaces, and there's some evidence base of that. So this may be a little bit kind of controversial, and it's certainly it's not evidence basis. But if you said, look, there are something like 150,000 people have died of COVID, if you took a reasonable, very small estimate, and say, well, it is maybe 10% of that is due to buildings being poorly ventilated, still 15,000 people. if that had happened in any other sphere of influence, you would change that overnight. So that's one thing. I think the other thing now is that people's awareness of ventilation has changed, partly because of this evidence basis. Now, I think it's a little bit unfortunate that ventilation came to this late. The messaging at the start was hands, face, space, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Now, all those things are entirely right, but the whole ventilation message only really started to happen probably about this time last year, when we were starting to look at what might be happening about people socializing ahead of Christmas and so on. So it was late, but what it has done is raise people's awareness of ventilation. So I think somebody mentioned, lots of stuff in the media, lots of campaigns. We were involved in some stuff this time last year. There's other stuff going on at the moment. So people's awareness of the importance of ventilation, I think, has been raised. I think that's been a kind of positive. I think the other thing which COVID has done is that it has, in a sense, shone a light on the fact that we don't know how a lot of buildings are performing. Most buildings are performing, that's changed. There has then, as a result of that, been an increased emphasis on ways of trying to evaluate ventilation. So things like use of CO2 sensing has become much more widespread in lots of different kind of sectors. And again, I think that will be useful in terms of giving us insights. What's interesting about some of that work is that it gives you quite useful insights. I mean, for example, some of the work that was done looking at ventilation in schools in Scotland actually found that most of the classrooms were okay, actually. They weren't, it wasn't disastrous. Some were quite poor, but actually the things to fix those were relatively simple. It was unsticking the windows and better advice and stuff like that. So I think there is kind of potential to sort of use that information. One of the problems about air quality is you can't see it and you can't perceive it.
Yep.
We have evolved to detect thermal comfort because our lives depend on it. Okay, whether you're too hot, too cold, things like that. But you don't physically detect poor indoor air quality. So that's why the use of sensors can be a really valuable tool here. It can tell you something that you wouldn't otherwise have seen. And I think that might be an important kind of way forward out of this. So I think the pandemic has triggered quite a lot of things. And I think some of that will feed forward into what we do next. I know there will be a lot of emphasis next year from government, from UKRI, about looking much more closely about issues of air quality and pollution.
Excellent. Some very good points there. And I mean, not least you get what you pay for, and arguably we just do not value good and clean air for everybody enough. I mean, I was thinking when you said about 15,000 deaths, obviously if plane crashes cause 15,000 deaths in a year, then to say the least, air safety will be going through the most wholesale review imaginable. But perhaps the implication then is that we're not convinced of the cause and effect between buildings and these things. So maybe in a perverse sense, we're at the stage where we need to sell them the problem more directly in order that we can sell them the solution. Maybe those linkages are not necessarily quite clear enough yet. So we're now moving, I've got 10 minutes for my last section because we've got a couple of questions. I'll remind the audience to type them in the Ask a Question box. I've had a couple on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. So this last section, we'll rattle through it in a few minutes. So we've done challenges and conflicts. I'm now going to invite you to do positives and hopes. So this is the reasons to be cheerful. We're going to look at successful, sustainable approaches to ensuring levels of indoor air quality are met, even exceeded, in a programme of housing that's built on health and well-being. So this is real crystal ball, future gazing, rose-tinted spectacles on. I'm asking you to see the glass more than half full, the art of the possible. It's everything IAQ could be, should be. So fast forward 5 or 10 years, putting on your future goggles. Chris, what will the tech-enabled home of tomorrow be like in terms of IAQ 5-10 years down the line?
Yeah, well, I mean, 5-10 years is a kind of fairly long time, I suppose, at the moment in technology, because it's evolving so rapidly, and quite often, as in any industry, it's regulation often needs to catch up. But I think, just mentioning what Tim said, I really like that kind of analogy or point around
Exactly. So that's point. So increasingly moving towards the smart connected home and life, potentially, car, gadget, everything. The Fitbit for the home, as you kind of described it. But of course, what that's generating is data. And in some cases, what we're saying is we don't even have the data yet. Never mind, we haven't analysed the data. So that's some nice points. And I'm seeing the question come through now. We're getting questions queuing up, so I'm going to rattle along with this final bit. So some quick thoughts, Tim, from you, please. Positive thoughts. How might the next generation of architects do things differently, better on IAQ? How could it be different in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, well, it certainly will be different. I mean, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we know we are going to have to design buildings differently anyway because of the climate agenda, because of the climate and carbon agenda, which is going to mean innovations in terms of how we design buildings. And one of the interesting dimensions of that is that ventilation actually becomes quite an important component of the building design from an energy perspective, which means it'll need careful attention. One of the kind of, in a sense, stopgap so far is that we've pushed very hard on energy, but not caught up with ventilation. And I think we're sort of rebalancing that a little bit. Certainly, I think there is potential for better tools for design and analysis in terms of that. I think a key one is an awareness. I mean, this will both be push and pull. It should be a pull from clients. So clients or buildings commissioning their architects should be making demands on what they want. And the point that Ian made earlier, so ask them to go beyond the bare minimum to something which is high performance, healthy buildings, is really kind of critical. I think the push is also something which can come from architects in terms of, this is how we can design things better. One of the strongest messages in all of this, both in terms of regulations, both for retrofit and for new build, is the concept of holistic approaches. So if you try and salami slice each problem down to its component parts, you can push down hard on one thing, something else pops up. So the ability for architects to have that overview, I think is potentially very positive. If they have got two things. Firstly, the skills, because the thing I mentioned earlier about fees, you've got a chicken and egg problem, which is that if you don't have very much sort of design fee, then you can put very little time in it, which means you don't hold those skills. So there is certainly something around that. I think the other thing is that we, with the ability to kind of monitor performance, I think we will move towards more performance-based standards in some way or another. So it is this thing about the thing has to do what it says on the tin. Ticking the boxes at design strategies won't be sufficient. We will need a much better evidence basis, and I think that will push things forward also.
Excellent, nice point. So ventilation, maybe rebalancing with energy in terms of priority and focus. Again, call for this holistic approach, which is crucial. Going forward, skills and fees. In many cases, the two aspects related, and of course, a more performance related vision, full stop. So Ian, if I come to you finally, and then we'll grab some of these questions quickly from you. Final one from me.
Well, I can be quick because I've just been crossing things off my list that Tim said, so I won't repeat them, but at least we're on the same page. But I guess, rose tinted glasses time, 5 years time. Firstly, I do agree. Air quality, indoor or outdoor, is a human right. It's not a privilege, and it shouldn't be on an indoor air quality side for the reserve of those who can afford an MVHR system. It should be for everyone. But on that note, I do think we are moving into a period where we are going to have more mechanical systems because of our more efficient building stock. So perhaps thanks to the future the heat and building strategy, we're moving towards air pumps. In 5 years' time, we might have to see cheaper unit costs for electricity, which will, because one of the reasons, particularly in social housing environments, why mechanical systems get switched off is because people are scared about the bill that they're going to receive. So cheaper electricity, that would be a good thing for the future. In terms of, I don't know, all the technologies we've talked about and the intelligence that might be needed to go into ventilation. I'm not a huge fan of building automation, whether it's domestic or non-domestic. That's a personal thing. But the one thing I would support is automation on ventilation, because ventilation, a good ventilation system, is one that you simply don't know that's there, because it's not noisy, it's not causing you any draft discomforts, it's been well designed, and it delivers the air quality you need. The problem is, though, that when it goes wrong, you won't know about it. And as Tim has said, we do not respond to our environment unless it's hot or cold. So the pollutants that are more dangerous to our health, if the control of a ventilation system can be automated through sensors, I think that's a good thing, providing there's a buzzer that goes off when the system fails and you need to get it maintained. So it's the communication of this that is important. But the good thing is we have all of this technology now. We've got everything. We can pull it all together. It's ventilation isn't complicated. It just needs thinking about.
It can happen, exactly. So good points there. And I think I would also add on, I know we've been touching on the idea that many of these are the invisible threat, and it's hard to mobilize perception and action on it. But I might throw out the idea that, well, of course, carbon is something typically you can't see in terms of climate, in most cases, and yet we've seen a big move in the last few years in people's perception of the problem of carbon. Although I would add that we've demonized carbon alone, and if we were to only demonize, say, carbon monoxide, that obviously would only be one very small part of the indoor air quality problem. But so picking up some of the questions, and first one I'll grab, because the last 10 minutes is from Craig McKenzie, and I'll throw this, I think, to you, Ian, first, and then maybe Tim. As M&E design consultants, we often see mechanical ventilation systems being value engineered out in favour of natural ventilation where openable windows. This solution obviously relies on the building occupants to regulate the airflow, and as Tim mentioned, people may not notice airborne pollutants. So how can we address this issue going forward? So first Ian, then Tim, on the idea of it's on the spec originally, but then it gets valued engineered out, the cost cuts it, and you're left with just, well, it's down to the occupant, the homeowner, whatever, to open windows in an intelligent fashion. Ian, how do we stop that happening?
I'll keep my rose-tinted glasses on and say in 5 years' time, all quantity surveyors and clients will be sufficiently educated about the importance of ventilation. Because it is true, it does. I recognise that comment on many projects I've been involved with, that the ventilation system is often value engineered,
Yep.
along with other systems as well. But yeah. But it does come back to education and understanding the importance. And with my hat on as a building performance evaluator, it is the one thing that I often say around design team tables is that you need someone, whether it's an evaluator or an extended skill by the architect or whoever's got influence around the design team table, that they should be able to articulate all of these issues. So things shouldn't get cut out. You wouldn't remove the front door just because it's cheaper. And the ventilation system, and it's not to rule out. It's not to rule out natural ventilation systems completely. There are innovations around natural ventilation, but you've just got to work a bit harder to demonstrate it. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to prevent systems and the intelligence that might need to go with mechanical systems as well to operate them in the way we've said before.
But optimistically, you feel that's a phase that we're going to grow out of in the next 5 years, potentially.
I'm seeing it already.
Okay, good.
I think probably a few years ago there was a big race for everyone to go and fit heat recovery ventilation systems into low carbon homes, and I think people caught a bit of a nasty cold in a number of example cases. Maybe it wasn't designed properly or installed properly, or didn't understand the frequency of filter changes, and eventually the systems failed. And so it sort of got blacklisted in a sense. So people are reticent about continuous mechanical ventilation, particularly if there's filters. So, and things have moved on from that point.
Well, if I could take,
I think it's going to continue to do so.
Good to hear. Yeah, perhaps not as quick as we'd like, but good to hear. And thanks. So if I could bounce the same question to you then, Tim, I also have a second question. So the first one is, would you like to add a comment about to what degree architects can put their foot down and stop some of these things being taken back out again? That's question one. The second question I had come in via Twitter. It's asking, well, we've talked about education and skills, but it says when it comes to research, what's the potential for universities to change or drive that agenda on IAQ? So two questions there. One on the how do architects stop the cost cutting that takes these things out? And secondly, what role is there for unis for research to help drive the agenda?
Okay, I'll have a go at both of those. I mean, it's related to that question about how, what is the building supposed to do, and who is taking that overview, and who has authority over that. I think, that's if that building is designed for mechanical ventilation and it gets shifted to natural, then that's clearly, that feels like that's going to be a problem. So, there are mitigations there. So the inherent in the question is, how do people know what to do? So something like indoor air quality sensors actually are very useful devices. One of the things that people tend to be more satisfied with free running buildings, ones in which they can control the environment themselves, but that's from a thermal perspective. Because they can perceive that, so they feel comfortable because they can open and close stuff. That doesn't apply to air quality. So having forms of sensor which can give you an indication of that, help you to do stuff. I'm looking at stuff in my room at the moment. In a minute when this finishes, I'll need to go and open the door because it's a bit stuff in there. It's fine. I just know that in a way that if I didn't have it, I wouldn't know it. In terms of the second bit of the question, which is what control with architects have? No, it's about research, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
To what degree can unis drive and inform this debate in a meaningful way?
Well, it's really important. I mean, one of the kind of challenges for research is how does it apply in the real world? And there is a lot of really interesting and useful research which is going on in universities. A lot of it is driven by the carbon agenda, but there's also stuff that that various people, ourselves and lots of other people, are doing in this field, looking at systems for better prediction, better modeling, testing of equipment, and particularly in trying to improve and streamline and develop ways of monitoring buildings and gathering this kind of data. and potentially using that for in regulation and policy, for example, and also feedback to occupants and building owners and so on. Excellent. So there is a lot of kind of potential there. I think some of it is also how that research then feeds back into education, and so that is education of designers, of architects, of engineers about why are we doing this, why is it important, what are we trying to do here. I think I hate that term, value engineering. Let's just call it what it is. It's cost savings. That's what it is. Okay. And that feels like a kind of a failure of programming in some way, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Okay. No, nice point. And then the final question, because we are almost out of time. I'm coming to you, Chris. I've got a question here about mass market, but maybe if I shape it a little for you. So I know you're active with schools and housing associations. You're putting in systems for larger user number groups, multi-occupancy units, I imagine, some with vulnerable residents, etc. And also we're aware that some of the tech is for the high-end residential market, where tech is bling. But the question really is about all those in between those groups, that great big swathe in the middle of 23 Acacia Avenue. How are we going to reach all those groups with the kind of solutions you're offering in order that their IAQ comes up?
Do you mean non-social housing?
Yes, exactly.
Do you mean Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when we first started, we were looking at particularly at social housing because we could see there's a lot of, could solve a lot of serious problems, relatively, hopefully easier at scale because of the size of the landlords. And that made and it's kind of great because it means that you're, putting cutting edge smart home technology in the hands of people that would often be last to get it, which is great. I think part of it for those people is it's a kind of wider educational piece, which I think is happening. It's happening as as part of COVID and people being aware that of indoor air quality, which I think is happening. And then also as homes become more and more retrofitted, the same thing will happen. People become more and more aware of the impact that the indoor environment has on their health. So I think that these things will naturally happen. I think it should be in the same way that at the moment smoke and CO alarms are regulated for all homes. I think it'll probably end up going down that route. I mean, you're talking about that value engineering case, right? It's a perfect example of someone's going, okay, I can save some money here and still tick the boxes. Great. But if they were held to account on the outcome, would they make the same decision? And how do you make them hold them to account on the outcome? You need some sort of control feedback mechanism, right? You need in a control system, you need a feedback mechanism. And I think, I can just see that it going that way would have that potentially positive impact. But I also think that the compliance angle and legislation angle is what drives social housing, but in the consumer market, maybe more around education and things like this, which will continue to happen.
Excellent. So good point to finish on, as well as regs, obviously, that accountability, which is what we're really talking about for performance, especially, or for non-performance, shall we say, can essentially start with data, and that data will inform the education piece as well. So good point to end on. So we're bang on time now. So a big thank you to all our panelists, Ian, Tim, of course, Chris, and our sponsors at ACO, to yourselves out there, virtual audience and Crowdcast, for your comments and questions. A reminder to check out elementalexpo.com. So at the top of the show, it's the online community for professionals focused on innovation, heat, water, air, and energy, the vital elements. Cue the name within the built environment now and in the future. Full diary of events on the website, including upcoming webinars, back catalogue, available to watch on demand. I've already seen a question which has been answered in the chat. You can rewatch the start of this. You can go back, you can share it. Almost the second we press end here and you finish, it's immediately available to review and watch again. So thank you once again to our three panelists. That's it for today. I've been Jim McClelland, editor at SustMeme. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks.